The experiments which were conducted by Griffith and Hershey and Chase proved beyond doubt that DNA is the genetic material. However, some organisms like viruses were found to have RNA also as the genetic material. So in this video, we are going to compare DNA and RNA and find out the reason that why, which is the and why and which out of the DNA and RNA is the better genetic material. So let us study with a few points. DNA over here and RNA over here. We are comparing the two on the basis of few important points. The first important point which we are going to discuss is the mutation. Mutation is the sudden change or the change in the genome of an organism, and it is required for the evolution. Now when we study, both DNA and RNA are known to show the mutations. That means both the material DNA as well as RNA are known to show the mutation, and hence evolution is seen in the organisms having DNA and RNA. The second point important, which is for the genetic material to have, is the stability. It is important because the information, the flow of the information should be stable from generation to generation. In the case of DNA, when we find that DNA is having one OH group as the functional group, and this functional group is responsible for the reactivity, whereas the RNA has two functional groups. It will have two OH functional group. Now, the lesser the functional group, the low is the reactivity. So here, due to one OH group, it will have low reactivity, and hence it will be more stable. In terms of reactivity and also structurally stable. When we come to RNA, since it is having two functional groups, it will have comparatively more reactivity, or we will say more reactive, due to the presence of two functional groups, and therefore it is less stable and also it is structurally unstable. The other reason being, when we talk of the flow of information, in the case of DNA, the information passes from DNA to mRNA and from mRNA to the synthesis of protein. Now here, the DNA to mRNA, this information flow is known as transcription, where all the information is passed to mRNA, and mRNA then translates this code into the synthesis of the protein, particular kind of a protein. This flow of information from DNA to mRNA and to the synthesis of the protein is known as the central dogma. Central dogma is important because it is actually the flow of information from DNA to mRNA and finally to the protein synthesis by the process of transcription and translation. We are in the case of RNA, where RNA is mainly responsible for the protein synthesis. But in organisms having RNA as the genome, the information flow is RNA to DNA and this into mRNA and the protein synthesis. Now here, since the information flow is reversed, here it is DNA to mRNA, here it is RNA to DNA. This process is known as reverse transcription, where the flow of information is from RNA to DNA and then the synthesis of the protein takes place. So here also we find that the flow of information from DNA to mRNA and protein synthesis does not require more steps, whereas in the case of this it is more steps, because RNA is coding or passing the information to DNA. The DNA then further passes the information to mRNA. Now, talking of the structural stability, we have to find out that the stability over here is more in the case of DNA, because it is having one nitrogenous base as thymine. Now, thymine pairs with adenine. Now, here in the case of RNA, it is uracil is present over here. Now, uracil is present in place of thymine. Here we find that cytosine, which is one of the nitrogenous base supposed to pair with guanine, forms uracil when it is deaminated. So when cytosine undergoes deamination certain times and it forms uracil. So therefore it is not always happening, but it can happen. So we find that structurally DNA is more stable, and this, since RNA is having uracil as a nitrogenous base, the chances are that cytosine, when it undergoes deamination, it may form uracil. So it is structurally less stable. And also it is more reactive. Talking about the passing of information, replication is an important process so that the information can be transferred as such. We find that both the DNA and the RNA undergo replication. So when we compare DNA as a genetic material versus RNA as a genetic material, we find that the mutation is taking place in both, that is DNA and RNA. Replication process is taking place in both DNA and RNA. But the points in favor of DNA being the genetic material is it is more stable, because it is having low reactivity, and structurally also it is stable due to the presence of thymine. Also, when we compare it with RNA, RNA is more reactive due to the presence of two functional groups and is also less stable due to the presence of uracil. Since uracil is present, the cytosine, which is a nitrogenous base, undergoes deamination and may form uracil. So structurally it is unstable, or we can say not unstable, it is less stable as compared to that of DNA. And the flow of information in the case of DNA, it is from DNA to mRNA and the protein synthesis, whereas in the case of this, it is reverse. So we find that since DNA is more stable, the flow of information is smooth, it is a much preferred genetic material. And also the experiments by Griffith and Hershey and Chase has also proven that DNA is the genetic material.